Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 9th of June of 2026. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where according to information we have, the Ukrainians are going to open the Crimean front line. Everything started several days ago when the Ukrainians attacked the Chongar Bridge, and this video was published 2 days ago, and in this video we can see how exactly the Ukrainians using 3 drones were attacking this territory. As a result of this attack, these bridges were damaged. This information later was confirmed by pro-Russian sources and by pro-Russian authorities. The Ukrainian armed forces struck a bridge near Chongar on the Crimean border, temporarily blocking traffic through the Jankoy crossing. And as a result of this attack, the Russians were forced to reroute their logistics. The Russians used to have 3 logistic roads several days ago. The Russians were able to support and supply Crimea along the road between Melitopol and Crimea through this Chongar Bridge. The second place that the Russians were using to support Crimea is the road that goes through the settlement of Armyansk, and the third road goes through the settlement of Henichesk. So this is the third road that the Russians use to support and supply Crimea. And as we can see, as a result of attack, the Ukrainians managed to damage and to close one of these logistic lines. The Russians are not able to use this road through the settlement of Henichesk because, as you can see, this road goes further in the eastern direction of Crimea, so which means that the logistic road is becoming very big in comparison, of course, with the road if you use the city of Armyansk for the logistic purposes. So that is why if you want to supply the city of Sevastopol or the western part of Crimea, of course, people, business and military forces would prefer to use the settlement of Armyansk in this situation. And this is exactly what the Ukrainians were planning. When talking about the settlement of Armyansk, then we can say that the distance between this city and, let's say, the city of Kherson is around 108 kilometers. When talking about this bridge, the distance between this bridge along M18 road and the same point in the Kherson region is 169 kilometers, which means that the distance to the settlement of Armyansk is 1.5 less in comparison with the distance to the area around the settlement of Chongar. Furthermore, when talking about this territory, when talking about the settlement of Armyansk, the length of this corridor is just almost 10 kilometers, which means that if something happens and if the Russian civilians, business or military forces are forced to use this corridor for any purposes, then of course we understand that the Ukrainians, most likely due to drones they have, due to the internet connection, satellite connection, the Ukrainians would be able to establish complete fire control over this territory using drones and missiles. And of course, in this case, if Russians decide to use this territory, they may start suffering huge problems. And the most important thing is that all these things that the Ukrainians have created in the northern parts of Crimea is not something like the logistic war. This is not something against logistics. This is not something against the supply and support of Crimea. The situation that we can see right now, that you can see in front of your screens, is the situation against the military forces of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. And the thing is not about this, of course, Crimea, but the problem and the thing is the southern parts of Kherson, so this territory. So what is happening in this area? During the previous 24 hours, we received a very interesting report published by both pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian sources, by neutral mappers and so on. First of all, the Ukrainians attacked the settlement of SKADOVSK, and as a result of this attack, the Ukrainians managed to damage and to destroy a gas station in the northern parts of the settlement. But it seems that the Ukrainians attacked this gas station with the purpose not to damage or to destroy this gas station, but to test whether the Ukrainians are able to attack this territory. As you can see, the settlement of SKADOVSK is located almost on the same line as the settlement of Armyansk. So basically, by attacking the settlement of SKADOVSK, the Ukrainians were practicing to attack the settlement of Armyansk, which means that if something happens, the Ukrainians will have possibilities to attack any target in this area as well. Another important update is that during the previous 24 hours, lots of sources, mainly pro-Ukrainian sources, began publishing a very interesting information. Russian forces are leaving the Kinburn Peninsula in the Nikolaev region. Actions to cut off supply roads have forced the Russians to hastily evacuate the area. The 337th Regiment is abandoning its position with supply lines completely halted. Delivery of ammunition, fuel and food has ceased. Due to significant personal losses, the 337th Regiment units are being withdrawn from the coastal line on the northern and western parts of Peninsula. Fire groups are unable to counter drones of the armed forces of Ukraine, and losses continue to grow. So many pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians, due to the current situation, were forced to abandon their positions through the Kinburn Spit. We're talking about this territory. And the Russians were forced to move further in the eastern direction with the purpose to take under control and to take positions, more favorable positions, so mainly on the territory of the mainland. So this is the situation that was reported today by several pro-Ukrainian sources and by several pro-Russian sources. As of the end of the 9th of June of 2026, the most reliable pro-Russian sources haven't confirmed this information, but we need to understand that they won't do this ever. Another important thing is that if we increase the number of updates since the beginning of June, or probably even, yes, let's do this since the beginning of June, you'll see that during this period of time, we have received lots of very interesting updates on this matter. First of all, during the previous, June, since the beginning of June, the Ukrainians made 3 or 4 attempts to attack the Kinburn Spit using Marines and fast boats. And the Russians, as of now, control this part of the Black Sea. And since the beginning of this month, the Russians destroyed several marine boats, fast boats with Ukrainian Marines on board. As a result of attack, all these boats were destroyed. For example, in this video, we can see at least 2 fast boats of the armed forces of Ukraine that were moving in the direction of the Kinburn Spit. And the Russians, when discovered these boats, they destroyed them. So according to this video, first Marines of the armed forces of Ukraine were moving in the direction of Kinburn Spit, but these boats were destroyed somewhere several kilometers off the shore, which means that the Ukrainians have already begun attempts to send Marines with the purpose to land infantry on the territory of Kinburn Spit with the purpose to gain, first of all, immediate victory. For example, in this video, we can see more boats of the armed forces of Ukraine that were moving towards the same direction, and these boats were also destroyed by Russian drones. So which means that since the beginning of June, the Ukrainians made at least 3 media attempts, not like media attempts from the perspective of a picture or something like this, but attempts that were recorded and were published through media. So there were at least 3 recorded attempts from the armed forces of Ukraine using small fast boats to land infantry on the territory of Kinburn Spit. As of the end of the 9th of June of 2026, the Russians have managed to repel every single attempt from the Ukrainian side, but another important thing that these 3 attempts carried out by the Ukrainians were just practice to understand how exactly the Russians are going to react on this situation. Probably there would be few more attempts from the Ukrainian side. They will understand what kind of aviation the Russians are using, what kind of drones the Russians are using for these purposes, what kind of airfields the Russians are using for these purposes. And most likely when the Ukrainians understand the tactics of Russians, they will carry out a major offensive operation in the direction of the Kinburn Spit with the purpose to land infantry and to dig as deep as possible. And of course, under complete fire protection with FPV drones and artillery from the Ukrainian side. Most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to develop their offensive operation further and deeper, but even the fact that the Ukrainians landed on the territory of Kinburn Spit could become significant media victory for Zelensky, for Ukraine, and this may allow the Ukrainians to get additional fundings from the European countries. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget about the situation around the settlement of Aleshki, which is located right in front of the city of Kherson. For example, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians carried out another attack on the city using aviation and using bombs. And in this video, we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking strongholds and positions of Russians on the territory of the city. And another important thing worth attention is that probably in the end of May, since the end of May, there were several reports that Ukrainians announced or suggested the Russians to carry out an evacuation from the settlement of Aleshki. If you remember, we had reports about this, and the Ukrainians proposed the Russians to start the evacuation of civilians from this area due to the situation that the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the settlement of Aleshki significantly, and that this town doesn't have water, electricity, and so on. And once again, the most important thing that this proposal was made by the Ukrainian side. So the Ukrainians proposed the Russians to evacuate civilians from this area. And when talking about the special military operation, about this conflict, we haven't seen anything like this since the beginning of the conflict. The Ukrainians never suggested the Russians to evacuate population from this or that direction, and the Ukrainians were even okay if the Russians evacuate civilians of Aleshki deep inside of the territories under complete Russian control, which is also a very important situation, and which means that the Ukrainians were making everything they can with the purpose to clear the territory of Aleshki and to prepare a foothold before another landing operation. And of course, now when talking about a foothold between the settlement of Aleshki and the Kinburn Spit, from this perspective, we see probably the beginning of the Crimean front line. Obviously, the Russians see the situation, but the most important thing that when everything happens, and if everything happens, the Russians would be forced to use two roads, either through the settlement of Armyansk or through the settlement of Henichesk. But when talking about Henichesk, the distance from this configuration is much bigger in comparison with the city of Armyansk or the city of Chongar. But the Chongar bridge was destroyed, and when talking about the settlement of Armyansk, if Russians decide to use this road, obviously the Ukrainians would try to attack this territory with all types of weapons they have, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to introduce reinforcements along the river of Dnipro in the area of the settlements of Aleshki, Kherson, and the Kinburn Spit. So, but the most important thing that the Ukrainians don't have lots of time for this. Either they need to start this operation tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, so within June of 2026, or they will not be able to start this operation ever, because every single day the Russians improve their air defense capabilities, and sooner or later the Russians would be able to stabilize the air defense situation through the Crimea, Kherson, and the Zaporozhye regions, and then of course no chances for any landing operation would be for the Ukrainian side. And don't forget that there are tensions and crises through Kinburn Spit, through the settlement of Aleshki, and never forget about the situation around the settlement of Energodar. The Ukrainians also announced evacuation through this area several weeks ago. Most likely the Ukrainians managed to concentrate troops, and of course the Ukrainians may try to attack the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and if it happens, the Russians once again will have huge problems with redeploying troops in this area, because the shortest way through the settlement of Chongar would be unavailable for Russians, and the Russians would be forced to use the settlement of Armyansk for the redeployment purposes, and obviously these roads would be also under fire control from the Ukrainian side. So something is brewing through the Crimean front line, and obviously this is going to happen very, very soon. And another important thing, another important signal that confirms my projections and probably speculations, is the pattern of any Ukrainian special operation. Every time since the beginning of the special military operation, when the Ukrainians were planning something, it is always started with some assassinations or with some terrorist attacks or something like this. And I would like to point your attention that this morning another explosion took place on the territory of the capital of the Russian Federation, the city of Moscow. A car was, an explosive was there was an explosion, a car was destroyed, and the sources reported that a general, probably a general of the armed force of the Russian Federation, was wounded, or probably even more. And this is a clear signal that something is happening. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are trying to carry out this, probably one of the latest operations, the last operation, probably even of the summer, with fuel crisis, with attacks on Russia's authorities, leaders, and so on, and now with possible operation in the area of Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Crimea. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to happen next, because obviously the Russians see the situation, and most likely in coming days they will start counter actions. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation with massive attacks. The sources reported that the Russians are ready to carry out another massive strike. As of the previous night, according to information we have, the Russians used 168 drones. As of the previous 24 hours, the Russians used more than 300 drones to attack the territory of Ukraine. And once again, the Russians were attacking gas stations, the Russians were attacking bridges, the Russians were conducting reconnaissance operation. The Russians destroyed 2 gas stations in the area of the settlement of Pavlograd, which means that the Pavlograd logistics between Pavlograd and the city of Pokrovsk has collapsed. The Russians currently carry out reconnaissance operation over the Dnipro region. The Russians are trying to gather intelligence information and to find targets they're going to attack within the next massive attack. Furthermore, the Russians are doing the same thing through the northwestern parts of Ukraine, through the Rivne region. Today we start receiving reports once again that Russian reconnaissance drones are flying over this territory, gathering the surveillance information. And another important thing is that pro-Ukrainian sources stated that the Russians most likely during the upcoming days will attack the Chernigov post office. I would like to remind you that these days the Russians attacked and destroyed the Kharkiv post office. This attack took place yesterday, and we are talking about this huge facility, and these are the consequences of attack. The building was almost completely reduced to ruins. Before the city of Kharkiv, the Russians attacked the city of Dnipro, and a post office was destroyed between the settlements of Podgorodny and Dnipro. We're talking about these territories. Before that, the Russians attacked the city of Kiev with its post office, and the Russians attacked the western parts of Ukraine. Which means that most likely the Ukrainians came to the conclusion that this time the Chernigov post office would be destroyed as well. And we are talking about a very big building that Ukrainians may use for the military purposes and to support and supply the armored force to Ukraine. The Russians, as you can see, continue destroying the Ukraine's logistics, trucks, carriers, and so on, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to carry out any operation against Russia as well. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and the most important updates are coming from the city of Konstantinovka and from the line from the Konstantinovka-Slaviansk agglomeration, more precisely. The Russians continue offensive through the city of Konstantinovka. As for the previous 48 hours, huge changes were recorded, and it seems that in coming days, probably in coming week or two, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm complete control over the settlement. Another important thing is the Ukrainian authorities announced the Kramatorsk evacuation. The sources reported that the Ukrainians announced the evacuation of the settlement of Malotaranovka, which is located in the southern parts of the Kramatorsk agglomeration, the settlement of Bilinky, which is located in the northeastern part of the agglomeration, and the Ukrainians evacuates the settlement of Privilya. So which means that the entire Kramatorsk agglomeration in coming days would be completely evacuated, and the Ukrainians would deploy significant number of troops with the purpose to hold the agglomeration for as long as possible. Furthermore, the Ukrainians announced the evacuation of some streets and buildings, mainly streets and micro-districts of the city of Slaviansk as well. So the Ukrainians officially began the preparation of the Slaviansk-Drushkovka battle, the final battle of the special military operation, the final battle of the Donbas arc operation, the final battle before Russians change their demands for a peaceful settlement of the conflict. If this battle ends in Russian favor, then the Russians most likely will change their demands. If Russians lose the battle for the Slaviansk-Drushkovka, then most likely we'll see either freezing of the conflict or even a settlement of the conflict, but most likely in Ukraine's favor. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.